Hello and welcome to an event as part of the York Festival of Ideas. I'm Ruth Penfold-Mounce from the University of York, and I'm going to be chairing today, or rather I'm going to be interviewing our speaker this evening, or rather this afternoon. I am delighted to welcome Helen today. Helen is Professor of Film and Television Studies and Partnerships Lead for the Warwick Institute of Engagement and co-founder of the Centre for Television Histories at the University of Warwick. That's a lot of achievements in there. She works collaboratively with archives and curators to engage the public with the history of British broadcasting and has twice been awarded the university's prizes for impact community engagement for this work. Helen and I are going to be chatting about how death, dying and bereavement are represented on television and how television can bring back the dead. From melodramas to the ghost serial, from historical to contemporary factual television, we're going to be discussing how TV can provide us emotionally realistic representations of grief, bereavement and death-related trauma, and how it can offer us access to the dead. And notably, all of this discussion will be coming out in a publication because it's about Helen's book, which, let's talk about that, shall we?
Thank you.
So welcome. But before we dive into the book, which I've had the privilege to read the preview version, I really enjoyed reading it. That's why I've got pages of questions, which we'll get through some of them. But let's start out at the beginning. Professor of Film Studies, why should we take film and TV seriously? Why is this a really important area to be working in?
Well, I guess if you ask anybody who studies film and television, they would say, just as people who study literature or drama, any other cultural form, film and television make meaning in the world. They are incredibly important to their viewers. Lots of us watch TV. I'm a scholar of television, a professor of film and television studies. So I believe that, you know, we engage with television on a regular, sometimes day-to-day basis, and we expect to be entertained by it, but also we expect it to help us make sense of the world, to understand our lives, to understand a bit more about the way that other people live around the world or next door. So that's why television's important, and that's why television is an important medium for the understanding of death, dying and bereavement, which is kind of, there you go, I've told the argument of the book. We can all get home now.
So this book that's coming out, this television/death.
I love short titles.
You like short titles, that's always good. How long has it taken you to write, and when is it actually coming out?
Oh, so I kind of started working on the book about 8 years ago, off the back of a book that I just finished, my last monograph, which is called Spectacular Television, and wrote a little bit about the presentation of the dead body on TV in that book, and out of that book grew the seed of what became Television Death. So I've been working on it on and off for about 8 years, alongside doing other things, of course. What else did you ask me?
No, that's all good. So, so you kind of got inspired to write it. Was there a particular instance, like a triggering moment, that you're like, actually, this is something that needs to be looked into?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I guess I've been writing about, in the previous book, I've been writing about the television work of Gunther von Hagens, the kind of celebrity pathologist who people may have seen his work, both his Body Worlds exhibitions, which tour all around the world, but then also his programmes on TV for Channel 4. And I had been really interested in these programmes and kind of how they presented the corpse on TV, and thinking about the idea of them as kind of offering a kind of spectacular image of death and dying on television. And then really it was kind of tracking back from there and thinking about, well, what are the other stories? How else does television tell the stories of death? And how else does it present the experience of death and dying. So it kind of began, as the book begins, the book's sort of in 3 parts. I don't know if this, I hope I'm not kind of
spoilers
anticipating your questions, but so book's in 3 parts. The first part of the book thinks about the representation of death and dying on television, and that might be documentaries about dying experiences, from religious broadcasting to the output of the BBC's Community Programmes Unit, who made really interesting programmes in the 70s and 80s about death experiences, to documentaries made all around the world about the experience of having an assisted death, requesting an assisted death at Dignitas and other places. And the first part of the book also thinks about the representation of death in television drama, so how people dying appears on TV. Then the middle part of the book looks at grief and bereavement and dramas that work through the experience of grief and bereavement, both dramas that kind of announce themselves as being about the experience of being bereaved, or also I looked at some ghost dramas and thought about the ways in which ghost dramas allow us to work through and understand and explore the experience of death-related trauma. And then the final section of the book looks at what I would call posthumous television, so how the people who have died, either recently or a long time ago, can be re-experienced, either through television programmes or through an encounter with the television archive. And I'm sure we'll kind of dig into
Yeah, absolutely. It's great you talk about these 3 sections, because that's really what I wanted to dive into as we start to engage with some of these issues about TV and death. And, you know, you start the book, and it was quite emotional right from the start for me, because you start talking about instances of on-screen deaths that weren't planned. People actually dying when they're performing or entertaining. And, you know, you're actually talking about these sort of actual deaths. So, you know, what are the challenges of sort of dealing with that sort of, the circulation of that sort of material?
Yeah, the book begins with a kind of deep description of the death of the British television entertainer Tommy Cooper. I see people nodding in the audience who maybe remember that happening. It happened on a programme called, ironically, Live from Her Majesty's. And Cooper is in the middle of his act. For people that aren't familiar with him, he was a kind of showman, faux magician, comedian, and he's in the middle of doing a kind of comedy magic act. And his assistant puts his magic cloak on him, and he starts to do his trademark just like that. And so that was what he used to do with his hands, and he kind of slumped to the floor, and both the assistant and the audience in the Queen's Theatre thought it was part of his performance, part of his shtick, part of his act. So they're all laughing, the assistant's laughing on stage, we can hear the audience in the auditorium laughing. And it becomes clear after, it feels like forever, it's probably only a couple of minutes, it becomes clear that actually he's had a heart attack and he's dying on screen, and a hand comes out from underneath the curtain to kind of drag him backwards, and the theme tune plays, and they cut to an unexpected advert break. So a deeply poignant moment of unexpected death, as you described, Ruth. But what that sort of illustrated for me was the fact that television was, at that time, often live. Television still is quite frequently live. We watch live news broadcasts, we watch live sports broadcasts, we watch live entertainment. And whenever TV's kind of liveness is there, liveness carries with it the propensity for death. So death is, as we know, a part of life, and Cooper's death is just one example of many, of people either dying unexpectedly of natural causes during the course of a television broadcast, or people dying through murder, suicide, live on TV. and all other kinds of death in between. And it's interesting, one of the things, when I was doing the research for the book, one of the things that was actually quite harrowing, certainly very striking, is if you search for live deaths on television on YouTube, for example, what you'll find is kind of endless compilations that people have put together, either of kind of poignant and important deaths of kind of ongoing characters in TV series, but then also people simply dying on screen. And I watched a lot of those compilations. It's quite difficult viewing. But it has that sense that if television is inherently a live and kind of ongoing medium, then death will occur on the screen, and then the recirculation of that death kind of defies the idea of television's liveness again, because it's recorded and we're constantly taken back to it again and again.
Yeah, I suppose there's actually starts to be some quite ethical questions that start to emerge. Like you say, if you actually had to read, or not read, but watch those sort of compilations, there is that risk that, you know, the person who has died, that entertainer, has got family. So there are some of those ethical questions. Is that any...
Yeah.
You sort of start to think about some of that.
I don't know if you remember, we were in a research group together, and the question that I brought to the research group towards the end of the production of the book was about using illustrations. So the book begins with Tommy Cooper's death. Was it ethical? Was it the right thing to do to show a screen grab? I think legally I would have been allowed to do so, but ethically, because he, as a performer, had died during the course of you know, his regular TV performance and had not signed up to die on television. You know, I didn't feel that it was the right thing to do, to include an image of him dying on screen. On the other hand, there are images in the book of people who'd taken part in documentaries about their death, who'd explicitly signed up to tell the story of their dying via television. And that then seems like a different prospect, to show images from those documentaries.
Yeah. So TV itself can be incredibly intimate. The sort of stories that get told. I suspect, you know, I've certainly watched TV and been moved to tears. I suspect there's probably other people who are listening today that have had similar sort of encouragements. Sometimes it's, you know, whether it's fictional or factual, TV is very carefully constructed to be very sort of emotional. So whether it's in terms of these actual real life deaths that are happening, or whether it's the sort of fictional deaths, it brings that sort of intimacy with sort of death to us. Do you think that's actually giving us as consumers that ability to reflect on our own mortality, or is there a distancing that's there?
I think that the sense in which, particularly the documentaries that I write about in the first part of the book, these are not people who were famous before they decided to make a programme about their dying. These are people, ordinary people, just like you or I, who find themselves in the position of knowing when they're going to die because they're ill, because they've taken a decision to take their own life, or because they're at the end of their life and being cared for towards the end of that life. So they're people who've made a really kind of firm decision to appear on TV. But what's really important about how those stories are presented is that they're presented with a kind of intimate mode of address. We see people in their own homes. We see people being interviewed or telling their stories from their bedroom, you know, whilst making sandwiches for their family or planting plants in their garden. There's a kind of intimate register which encourages us, I think, as viewers, to draw connections between the stories being told on screen, sometimes very difficult and, as you say, moving and emotionally poignant stories about people's dying experiences. But the little bits of the everyday that kind of punctuate those stories are what kind of encourages us to reflect, I think, and think about our own lives, or we might be thinking about our own families or our own experiences of loss. So intimacy is really important from that point of view. I think it's what television does really well. And so whether it's through the intimate presentation of a kind of ordinary person's story on screen, or whether it's kind of taking us into the interior thoughts and feelings of a character through voiceover narration, which allows us to understand what somebody is thinking and feeling at a particular moment, television shooting that takes us very close to the face, or shots of hands. I wrote a lot about shots of hands and people clasping hands and letting go of hands during this book. Hands become really, close-ups of hands become really poignant in stories of death and accounts of grief and bereavement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I work in the area of sort of death studies, and, you know, when you're working with publishers or you're going and speaking somewhere and they want some sort of image you circulate, the ones that they always sort of end up sort of going back to is hands. The clasping of hands seems to represent that sort of dying process, as that's what we do, that sort of comforting thing, which I think is quite distinctive.
That thing about connection, human connection, and human beings reaching out to each other, that's really important.
Yeah. So with this intimacy, there's a concept that you start to talk about, and that's parasocial grief.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what that means and, you know, elaborate on that? Why is it important? Why did you start to think about some of this?
Well, parasocial grief is not a term that I coined, but it was a term that was coined to talk about the ways in which, say, for example, you're following a soap opera and you've been following that soap opera for a long time. One of the other deaths that the book starts out with is the death of Hayley Cropper in Coronation Street, if there are any Corrie fans in the room. So she was somebody whose death story had extended across about 18 months, but beyond that, she'd been a character in the soap for many, many years beforehand. So both the characters around her who experience her dying and who deal with their grief and bereavement are kind of coping with that. But at the same time, the audience who've been following Hayley's story might experience some form of grief in and of themselves, in the sense of a kind of long-standing, ongoing character dying. So there's a really nice bit I think it's a really brilliantly written and directed few episodes around Hayley's death in Coronation Street. But the celebrant, there's a humanist celebrant who delivers her funeral eulogy and talks about the fact that when somebody dies, it's not just their very close members of their family who experience their death, but also the community around them. And there's this kind of double address, both to the Coronation Street cast of characters who are in the room at Hayley's funeral, but also kind of speaking out to the audience who are watching at home. So that's what the concept of parasocial grief means. And I think kind of beyond that, there's a sense in which I also talk about the idea of emotional realism, which also comes from soap opera studies, actually, from a Dutch scholar called Yen Ang. And she talked about emotional realism in relation to Dallas. She watched Dallas with groups of viewers of Dallas in the Netherlands in the 1980s. And she talked about the ways that they kind of emotionally connected with the character of Sue Ellen. I don't know how many people remember Dallas, but Sue Ellen, wife of one of the kind of central baddies in the series, and she was a bit of a lush and a bit of a drunk, and she's a bit of a nightmare with her kids and all of the rest of it. And so Ian Ang, through her audience research, talks about the fact that whilst the women that she was watching the soap opera with, you know, living in kind of massive ranches in Dallas in the United States, it's completely out of their sphere of reference. But what they connected with was the series' emotional realism, that sense of kind of feelings being explored, and they were recognisable kind of emotional experiences that this character had gone through, that these women really connected with. So I've sort of taken the idea of emotional realism and applied it to thinking about how dramas around death, and particularly the dramas of grief and bereavement, try and portray the experience of being bereaved or the experience of having a loved one who's dying in kind of emotionally realist ways. So even though we might not connect with the lives of the characters on screen, we connect with how they're living or their emotional experience of life.
Yeah. So this is the challenging part, because we watch TV is called entertainment.
Yeah.
We watch TV to be entertained, but actually this doesn't sound very entertaining to me, and yet we have these great audiences for some of these shows. What are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I would... does being entertained always mean having fun? Does being entertained always mean, you know, laughing or finding something amusing? I think being entertained also means opportunities to connect with an emotional experience. I think being entertained can sometimes mean the very hardest moment in your life, losing a parent, losing a partner, losing a child. It can be a very isolating experience, actually, and seeing stories of these kinds of things done well on screen lessen that isolation in a really kind of, you know, basic way. But I think also that sense of, even if we're watching a character experience a life experience that we haven't yet experienced ourselves, that sense of poignancy, of brilliant writing done well, or brilliant performance done really well, that enables you to see someone feeling is what's at the heart of particularly the dramas of grief and bereavement I write about.
Yeah, no, that's great. So going back a little bit and sort of building on some of the things we started to think about here, you ask in one of your chapters, you ask the following questions, just to refresh your memory. Who are assisted dying programmes made for? No. And how does it work through moral and ethical questions for who seeks, watches or films assisted death? Did you come up with answers to those questions?
I think so. So this is chapter 2 in the first section of the book, which is a chapter about the representation of assisted death on television, which of course is a kind of ethically difficult and emotive subject. And there is a whole series, like going back into the early... I need to check my dates. This is my crib sheet. It was basically a load of TV titles because I've got the memory of a goldfish. So going back to the 1980s, documentarists all around the world, in fact, have been making documentaries about assisted dying. One of my ex-students made a brilliant documentary about assisted dying, which is kind of where I started out. So he made a documentary with Terry Pratchett, which people might have seen, called Terry Pratchett Choosing to Die, where Pratchett goes to Dignitas, not for his own death, but with a guy called Peter Smedley to record Peter's death and to talk about the facts of choosing to die at a particular moment in time. But then when I looked at the broader history of those documentaries, they go back to the 1980s and to a documentary called Death on Request, which was a Dutch documentary that was brought for the Modern Times series for the BBC and broadcast late 80s or early 90s. My dates have escaped me down. It wasn't what I'd written down helpfully this morning. Anyway, so from that point on, we get documentaries made all around the world. I write about documentaries made in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in Australia, in the United States, and a couple of documentaries made here in the UK about the experience of assisted dying. And that question that Ruth asks, you know, who are they for? Who would want to watch somebody take their own life on TV? And that's certainly a question that campaigners against assisted death have asked. And these often these programmes are accompanied by special editions of programmes like Newsnight and things like that, where a debate takes place about whether, in fact, this should be seen on TV. So my sort of answer to the question of who are they for is multiple. They're for, firstly, the person who is seeking an assisted death. The experience of dying, as anybody who will know, who's had somebody in their life who's been heading towards the end of their life, will know. The experience of dying is often a time when you're losing your voice, you're losing your ability to kind of make decisions for yourself, losing a sense of autonomy, losing an ability to speak for yourself, and also you're also losing all of your ties to your friends and family. So the people who choose to make these documentaries are often doing so as an act of speech, an act of regaining a voice at a particular time. And either from a campaigning point of view, so to make the argument that assisted death should be easier for all of us to request, or from a kind of the point of view of, I want to tell my own story, it's really important for me to tell my story now. So they're partly for the initial subject. They're also for the subject's families. So lots of these documentaries have moments where either the person who's seeking an assisted death or their families start talking about the fact that, this is recording this moment in time for posterity, or, they're going to want to return to this when the person who's seeking an assisted death has died. So it's a kind of memento mori. It's a way of capturing a particular moment. But then, of course, the third group that these programmes are for is for the audience, because even if we believe even if we believe vehemently that assisted dying is wrong, being informed about it, knowing what that process is like, knowing, for example, how consent is taken and what that process actually looks like, and what the kind of physical processes are of seeking an assisted death. I think we need to inform ourselves about these things from both sides of the camp. It's really interesting. One of the documentaries I looked at was called How to Die, Simon's Choice. Again, a man with motor neurone disease seeking an assisted death at Dignitas in Switzerland. And Rowan Deacon, the director of that documentary, said to me that she was aware that the documentary had been screened by people campaigning on both sides of the fence, in terms of people who were both really in favour of an assisted death and people who were campaigning voraciously, campaigning against assisted dying. And both groups had shown screenings of her documentary. And she felt that was the kind of proof that it had done its job, that it enabled what it enabled was for people to talk to each other about assisted dying. And that was ultimately what she'd wanted to do with the documentary.
So it's like the power of the story. That the story can be used as that sort of springboard, like you say, by people who are often, vehemently opposed to the other's sort of beliefs, that actually this is a space to tell stories and have those discussions and those debates. Even if we don't agree, having those discussions is so
It's
crucial.
really interesting as well, because on British television, even way before anyone was making films kind of documenting that process, particularly on religious broadcasting kind of panel shows, you would get a panel together from the late 1950s onwards on British television with people representing both sides of that debate, and television then becomes a kind of space for discussion and discourse and a space where both sides get to air their views.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move slightly on and think about some different sort of issues here. Now, something that I think came up when I was sort of reading your work and, from my own TV consumption, death is often fast on TV. And so although there might be these sort of emotional sort of outbursts of like, oh, they're dead. I'm thinking something, whether it's, any, like Game of Thrones, where so many of the characters are dying, whether it's The Walking Dead. I do a lot of stuff about sort of zombies and apocalyptic type stuff. There are quite fast emotional deaths. You're like, oh, quick cry, moving on. Do you think we're seeing a shift to actually seeing more TV where there's actually much more emotional depth for us to be guided through?
I think we do. I think it was a point maybe in 2019, I reached a point where I realised that lots of the programmes that I was watching for pleasure were programmes that were about grief and bereavement, and they precisely shift the pace of the impact of death and dying on TV. So I'm thinking about programmes like This Is Us, very long-running, 6-season American drama, where we see an unfurling across 6, I think the seasons are about 20 episodes long. So 6 seasons of 20 episodes of people responding to a character's death right at the beginning of the series. That's really kind of slow unfurling of the kind of consequences of death and dying, and the kind of emotional experience of grief. In that chapter, I also looked at dramas like Sorry for Your Loss, which is a Facebook-based drama. I don't know how many people... I hadn't watched much TV on Facebook before that, but really interestingly showing the kind of slow experience of a character's... a young woman whose young husband dies unexpectedly, and... Again, over 2 seasons, we see the kind of the consequences of that death. The Leftovers, a fantasy drama series, but also in which a kind of an apocalyptic event takes place where about a third of the population suddenly disappears. But the series is not about that disappearance. The series is about the consequences of that disappearance and how groups of characters deal with their grief and sense of bereavement in different ways. So I think precisely we're seeing a kind of slowing down of that character's reaction. It's really going back to the Coronation Street example. 8 years after the death of his wife, there was a kind of a plot point where Roy Cropper, Hayley Cropper's husband, loses her red duffel coat, Hayley's famous red duffel coat for people that follow the series, and he's kind of revisited the trauma of her death. This is what television can do, I think, as opposed to film and as opposed to any other medium, really. Serial television drama enables the kind of slow unfurling of experiences of grief and bereavement.
Mm. So with that, I say that sort of TV, that sort of series, we have these sort of multiple episodes, but people are shifting to binge watching now, aren't they? So it's actually, when you watch these series that are potentially designed to watch over quite a long period, you sit and watch them like in a whole Saturday or like over your weekend, you sit and watch everything. So actually it's like that, the sort of scale of film, but that intensity of sort of more in-depth development of things like grief.
Right, yeah, that kind of... it's interesting. The ghost dramas, I think, that are looked at also kind of deal with... they're kind of made to be binged, really. Really kind of complicated narratives that kind of switch back and forth in time. So I've looked at things like... there's been some recent Netflix dramas, Haunting of Hill House, which is an adaptation of the classic novel. Also, I don't know if anyone saw Archive 81, which again is really kind of temporarily volatile series where characters are kind of dragged forward and back in time constantly, and that kind of... I think that sort of switching between narrative times really kind of lends itself well to dramas of grief and bereavement, where we're kind of constantly comparing the past with the present, and a sense of loss has to come with an understanding of the past. So I think if we binge those, Netflix is kind of well known for its bingeability, isn't it? But if we binge those ghost dramas, we really get a sense of the kind of I guess, a sort of mosaicing of time, or a kind of knitting together of complicated time to understand the experience of grief as kind of cyclical, constantly unfurling. I think we've moved away from that idea of grief as something that has a kind of linear narrative that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 5 stages of grief, which I'm sure lots of people in the audience will be familiar with, and that idea that we move kind of through the 5 stages and then out the other side. And I think more recent thinking about grief and bereavement has thought about it as something that stays with you forever, but kind of adapts in some way, or you adapt to it. You kind of bring grief as an experience into your life, and it kind of stays with you. So that sense of the kind of complexity of the grief narrative is no longer being a kind of linear, or we're going to go through this process and we'll feel better at the other end. But rather a kind of much more complex relationship between the past and the present is sort of represented really nicely in those complex TV dramas.
Yeah, so when I was sort of reading about that stuff, I'd never really thought about sort of ghosts as exploring this notion of sort of death. I mean, yes, it's ghosts, but actually making those connections, which you really start to do in the book. But what I think was interesting was you started to observe how these sort of ghost stories, they're rooted to a house or a landscape or a place. So it's not just moving between time, it's that location that seems to be really significant. And that's the sort of thing I'd love to hear more your thoughts about how these sort of ghost dramas actually help us explore sort of trauma and relationships.
Yeah, it's done so brilliantly by a whole host of television directors. We get that sense of place as being like central to a family's story, or central to the story of a loss. But ghost dramas tend to treat place as a kind of palimpsest in which there are kind of layers of history happening, and so we see bits of the past and bits of the present brought together in the same place. And I've been really interested in exploring not only haunted houses, but also haunted landscapes, forests, caves, anywhere where the past and present kind of coexist, and do so really richly. The moors, the coastline. So there's some really, really beautiful, fairly recent British television drama that does this particularly well. I'm thinking about series like the BBC's Living in the Dead. I don't know if anyone saw that ghost drama, but really wonderful use of location. The writer of the series talks about the location as an additional character, which people tend to do when there's really kind of rich symbolic use of space. Exploring the way that haunting takes place within a particular time and within a particular place. So dramas that are set in the same location but have kind of different timelines or interlinking. There's a narrative complexity in terms of the back and forth of time, and certainly a kind of spatial complexity about how that's represented.
Yeah, and that leads on very nicely to the last sort of section of your book, where you're really looking at posthumous TV, basically, is what you're looking at. And you talk about the sort of issues, I suppose, about the dead still continuing to perform.
Yeah.
It's quite challenging in itself, whether it's, somebody who has recorded TV in their lifetime and then they've died, and then we're still watching because we're still, laughing at the jokes of a particular comedian or particular TV series. But we also have the fact that we have the dead being resurrected to continue performing through CGI.
Which is something that you've written about.
Something I'm interested in. But I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts on this as the TV expert.
Well, so the beginning of the posthumous television section of the book thinks about the ways in which... So number of people have written about photography as a medium that captures life before death, from Roland Barthes onwards. And subsequently, people have also written about film as a way to kind of capture the dead before their death. All sorts of people have written really interestingly about that. Laura Mulvey, for example. And the disconnect was, why has nobody written about television in relation to this? Because television has that ability. As we all know, we probably all watch television that's been recorded in some way, whether we're accessing, downloading TV from a particular service, whether we've recorded something on a Skybox or whatever. We have the ability to bring television back from the past that we almost, it's so ubiquitous, we almost don't think about it. So I've been trying to think through how the ubiquity of television's kind of revival of the past might be discussed in relation to that idea of bringing the dead back. And as you say, I've sort of partly thought about that in relation to television performers coming back on screen through broadcast. So one of the people that I look at the beginning of that chapter is Victoria Wood, very well-loved television performer, and I started to track how often particular sequences of particular programmes have been replayed, both leading up to but also after her death. So television, it has its own kind of rhythms and patterns of memorialisation that allow its TV performers, well-loved TV performers, to keep performing after their death. I also think about more problematic TV performers and the return of more problematic TV performers. So the other person I've written quite a bit about is Jimmy Savile, and kind of what happens when we re-encounter a television performer with a much, much more problematic history posthumously. So rather than the kind of warm feeling of a kind of memorialisation, we get a sense of a character like Savile haunting TV. Those constant returns are both framed in television programmes as being haunting, and we kind of experience them as viewers as having a kind of haunting quality. So I was really interested in sort of how different encounters with television's own dead enable us to think about the possibilities and the kind of ubiquity of television capturing life before death. I subsequently, so I live in Coventry, I'm based at the University of Warwick and live in the city of Coventry, and I've been really interested in bringing programmes made in and about the city out of the television archive to re-show them around the city as a way to give people the opportunities partly to revisit and re-meet their own dead, more broadly to kind of revisit the city's history and its past. But during the course of that project, I had the opportunity to talk to a number of people who either accidentally or on purpose had an encounter with somebody they loved, friend or family, through one of my archive screenings. We showed bits of archive television kind of all over the city, lots of screenings in Coventry Cathedral, also in the Shopfront Theatre, which is a wonderful theatre which is sadly recently closed, built in an old fish and chip shop. So kind of from the sublime to the ridiculous, we took archive television everywhere around the city and gave people the opportunity to re-encounter the city's past and to re-encounter their dead. And they were really interesting and kind of poignant encounters with people who really, I think, you know, as a TV historian, I've been saying for years and years, oh, the television archive is important. It's it's an archive of national importance. It gathers together documentaries and dramas made by the best in the world, and you know that's why we should care for it, and that's why we should give access to it. But excuse me, enabling people to gain access to the television archive so that they could see their granddad who they hadn't seen for years and years and years, or an old friend who they thought they would never see again, or other members of their family and members of their community that were lost to them in every other way. That was the importance of the archive as kind of like a family album, certainly a community album, became all the more clear to me during that project. So, yeah, I think we access the dead through TV programmes, but we could also access our dead through archive exhibitions, making the archive more open. I've been able to work with brilliant collaborators at the BFI, the British Film Institute, the Media Archive for Central England, the BBC and others who've enabled me to make that set of programmes available for a community, and that needs to be a much broader project, I think.
This ties neatly to another question that sort of connects in with this, because like you say, it's for a community like it was Coventry, or whether it was, you know, archives about York, for example. This could be any sort of community. There is the selectivity of what has been captured.
Yeah.
And in your book, you record that actually you had a bit of a run-in with a Labour councillor, Kindy Sindhu, who was quite cross with you.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about that?
That was a really important moment for me in the research. So I had been invited by Coventry's Trade Union Council to go and show them some archive footage about the city's industrial relations. So Coventry is a working class city. It's the UK's motor city, a bit like Detroit in the sense that it's where the motor industry was based. And so part of the city's history is the story of boom and bust, the boom of kind of post-war production of motor vehicles, and then the decline of that industry. And I took a kind of show reel of bits of archive footage about that particular subject to the Trade Union Congress meeting, and there was lots of fun, and people were kind of recognising comrades, as they called them, recognising colleagues on screen, and, you know, calling out to the screen and going, that wasn't how it was at all, this reporting's biased, and, you know, so it was a really lively but fun response to the what I'd showed. And then at the end of the screening, Councillor Kindy Sindhu was in the room, and she was noticeably cross, and she raised her hand to ask a question, and she's like, how can you show this? This is not how this history was. Why are there only white people on screen? Why does this not tell the story of my parents, who were Labour leaders in that period, who were really kind of at the heart of kind of industrial relations in Coventry at that time? Why is this not on screen? And it was a real moment of, you know, why have I not told this story? And of course, the reason I didn't tell the story was it's not captured in the archive. So it sort of reveals the racial bias of it was an ITV archive that I was drawing on in that instance, but ITV reporting in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. But it really kind of, it called me up, because what I was doing, in a sense, was kind of repeating that lack, bringing this, you know, saying, oh, you know, this is, bringing this footage out of the archive to show people and to show people in the city and say this tells the story of the city. But it was a really important reminder that it's only ever a partial story. So subsequently went back and looked. There was you know, very, very little, but we were able to bring some additional programmes out of the BBC archive to kind of correct that bias. But I've been doing a really interesting project, an extension of the Ghost Town project with a colleague from Coventry University. And we've been taking archive footage again out to audiences in the community, to a residential home in Canley, which is a bit of the city very near my university, and also to the city centre, and asking participants 3 questions. this is all silent footage as well, so bits of silent Coventry news that were made to be kind of spoken over by a television reporter. And we asked people to tell us, what do you know about what's on screen? So the metadata is really sparse. So we were hoping to kind of fill in some details about where bits of footage were taken, or who was on screen, or what businesses, and so on. So what do you know about what's on screen? What do you imagine you would hear? Were you able to hear the sound? And then the third question is, who's not there? And who's not there is always going to be the question that I want to ask now when I'm taking bits of archive film, television out into the community. It should have been at the forefront of my mind during the Ghost Town project, but it certainly is now. Who's not there is really critical. Whose story isn't being told, whose voice isn't heard, whose face isn't seen on screen. Why do you think that is? So we kind of try and expose some of those biases and blind spots.
Fantastic. Now, it's time to sort of open up for some questions, but I'm just going to end with my one question. You just need to give me a very short answer, okay? What's your favourite TV death?
Oh, my goodness. What's my favourite TV death?
This is the hardest question, isn't it? It's supposed to be the shortest.
It's really hard. It's a murder.
Okay.
It's not my favourite because it's a murder, but I don't know if people watch This Is England, Shane Meadows' TV series, but I think... I don't want to spoil it for anybody that hasn't seen it, but a significant character is murdered halfway through the series, and again, the kind of ramifications of that death extend through the next 2 seasons, and it's handled really beautifully and realistically, and so
fantastic.
It's that.
That's one to watch out for.
Yeah, and I recommend that piece of television to anybody, but it's not pretty, and don't watch it with your kids.
Okay, thank you for that warning. So has anyone got any questions? We've got a microphone that will come to you.
That was so interesting, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And I've got like a million questions, but I was wondering if you'd looked at sort of comedies or comedy dramas about dying and death, and I'm thinking of things like The Good Place or BBC Ghosts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should have said that. I've realised I've missed out half of what I've written about. So there is a section of the chapter on the representation of death and dying on American television that deals specifically with representations of the afterlife. So The Good Place, the show Afterlife, I need to look at my crib sheet again, Forever, which is a great little Amazon drama if you haven't seen that, and Miracle Workers. And yeah, there's a kind of, there's a black humour to dealing with death, I think. My mum's sitting at the back of the room and she'll remember this. When I was an undergraduate student, I worked for a while as an auxiliary nurse in a nursing home. And I think that was probably my first encounter with death. So I would be responsible for sitting with patients as they were dying, for dealing with the immediate care of their bodies after their death. I think it's probably why I've written this book, if I'm honest with you. But there was a real kind of black humour to the way that people working in the nursing home, the undertakers who would arrive to take the bodies away. I think it's how people deal with death quite often. So yeah, I'm really interested in The Good Place and how it works through the kind of philosophy of death, if you like, in a humorous way. More to talk to you about that, definitely.
Yes, and then we've got a hand there as well.
Hi, thank you. Sort of linking to black humour, I wondered if you ever saw the series Way to Go, which was a series of, it was 6 episodes of some rather hapless gentlemen who
they were running an assisted dying business.
I wondered what you thought about that. And it wasn't screened during a key television time. It was screened rather late at night. I wondered what you thought about
It's a BBC comedy. It's really briefly mentioned in the assisted dying chapter. They make what they call their McFlurry of death to kill their clients. So I haven't watched much of it, to be perfectly honest with you, but it formed part of, I think, television works as a kind of cultural forum, so it works, and certain kind of issues and questions are kind of raised, and they run through not just television documentary, but representations of the issue on the news or representation of the issue in serious drama. And I guess comedy drama or sitcom, it deals with death and dying in at the same time. So this was around about the time that the assisted dying bill was being debated in Parliament as well. So I can't give you a kind of full analysis of the series because I haven't seen it all, is my really honest answer. But I think it's interesting that it exists because it comes at a time when there's lots of other different and much more serious kind of handling of that subject going on British TV. And I think it's around that the time that this assisted dying bill was being debated. Did you watch it?
I was doing some research, and part of it was looking up on a box of broadcasts, and I found it, and I hadn't seen it myself when it was broadcast. But my first thoughts were that how dare they put this serious subject into such a comedy situation, and but some of my supervisors were sort of going, well, you know, it maybe needs dealing with or whatever. But yes, I found it rather disturbing at first. Yes, yeah, exactly.
Newcomb and Hirsch have this idea of television as cultural forum, and they say what's most important is the raising of questions on television, and I guess rather than provision of answers, and I guess it's part of the airing of assisted dying as a topic, even in a slightly grim way.
Hi. Is there an afterlife to this book? What are you going to be studying next?
Oh my goodness, that's a really good question. There's a long answer to that maybe we don't have time for. I've got a project that I really want to do is about the representation of gypsies, Romas and travellers on television, and that has a kind of a connection to the latter section of the book, in the sense that I want to kind of resurrect some key performers who came out of those communities and take some of that archive footage round to GRT communities as well as settled communities. So but that's a kind of whole other kettle of fish.
Brilliant. Last question. Go for it.
No pressure.
It's a lot of pressure.
Sorry.
When I was a teenager, one of the books that kind of blew up was The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, which was definitely a way of introducing discussions of death to a young adult audience, and I really enjoyed the book. I wondered if you'd read it or seen the film and what you thought about the way it spoke to under 18s about death.
I have read it, and I watched my daughter sitting at the back of the room, and we watched it really recently, like last week, Dora, or something. And I've also heard a really interesting podcast with John Green recently. He's on the Heavyweight podcast talking about his own experience of grief and trauma, and sort of why he ended up writing the books that he ended up writing. So I was really interested to hear his kind of reflections. Again, I think it comes back to the thing that I've been talking about, and we've been talking about this afternoon, the importance of putting death into discourse. So like remembering the kind of that book blowing up, and like everybody was reading it, and then lots of people also saw the film. It's important that everybody recognises that death is part of life. Even for young people, death can be part of life. And so I guess that's that's sort of the connection with what I've been writing about and talking about, and John Green's book and film is it's really important that kids kind of have a space in which they can deal with grief and talk about grief too. And it also makes me think that there's a hole in my book which is about the handling of death and bereavement on children's television, because there has been some particularly good CBBC programmes that deal with experiences of death and dying. So thanks for that. I need to go away and think about that while I'm doing my
It's always good to
rewrite.
identify the chapter that's not quite in the book, so thank you for that. So just in closing, because we've run out of time, I just want to say thank you so much to Helen for having a fascinating conversation and answering so many brilliant questions from the audience. Thank you so much for those. Thank you for attending tonight's event, and be sure to check out what else is still happening with the York Festival of Ideas in the coming days. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.